The bell at Treneck Church tolled 9 times on a grey October morning, and Constance stood among the fisherfolk at the back of the churchyard and watched 4 men carry her own coffin to the grave. She had drawn the hood of a borrowed cloak close about her face. The wool smelled of salt and wood smoke and another woman's lavender, and under it her breath came short and shallow, the way it had come the night the packet boat broke apart on the Treneck bar and the sea took everything she owned. She knew the weight those 4 men should have been carrying. She had stood at her own father's burial once and watched the bearers strain, watched the slow, careful labor of a box that held a living body's worth of bone and flesh. These men did not strain. They moved the long pine box as easily as if it had been a hamper of empty bottles, and the ease of it told her everything before the first spade of earth fell. There was nothing inside it. They were burying her and the box was empty, and the man at the head of the grave with his hat in his hands and his face the color of the stone behind him did not know that the woman he meant to mourn was standing 40 feet away alive, watching. His name was Everard, and he was her husband, and she had not yet decided whether he was her enemy. That was the question that had kept her on her feet through the long walk down from the cliff path, the question that held her now at the churchyard wall, with her hand pressed flat against the cold lichened stone. She had to know what was in his face. Not the public face a gentleman wore at a funeral, the composed and dutiful grief that society required, and that meant nothing. She needed the thing underneath it. If he had wept for her in private, if he had fought the burial, if he stood at that grave because grief had driven him there, rather than because a clever woman had arranged it, then she could cross the grass and let her hood fall and end this. If he had not, then she was watching a man bury an inconvenient wife, and she would turn and walk back up the cliff path and let Constance stay dead, because a dead woman, at least, could not be sold. You may think you already know which it was. Stay with her a little while. She did not know yet, and she was the one who had loved him. The vicar's voice carried thin across the churchyard. The words of the burial service worn smooth by long use, ashes and dust, and the sure and certain hope. At the front of the small crowd stood a woman in deep mourning whose black was too fine for a fishing parish, whose veil was Honiton lace, and whose gloved hands were folded with the patience of a woman who has gotten exactly what she wanted and intends to look sorrowful about it. Constance knew her without seeing her face. That was the Dowager Lady Sidoni, her husband's aunt, who had run his house and his conscience since the year his mother died, and who had told Everard, in a letter Constance would later read, that the kindest thing he could do for the living was to bury the dead. 6 months earlier there had been a wedding instead of a funeral, and almost no one in the county had approved of it. Constance had come to Stonewell as a governess. She had not arrived, expecting to leave it as its mistress. Her father had been a clergyman of more learning than living, and when he died he left her a small shelf of Greek books, a pressed forget-me-not in a prayer book, and an income that would not have kept a cat in cream. She had answered an advertisement, packed the books and the prayer book and 3 plain gowns into a single trunk, and come north to teach the 2 small daughters of Everard's widowed cousin, who kept rooms in the east wing of the house, and whose children needed a steady hand more than they needed Italian. The house she came to was a quiet, half-shuttered place, a Jacobean manor of grey stone, above a cove where the sea came in hard against a bar of shingle, and the master of it was a man who did not, in those first weeks, seem to have much use for being alive. Everard had buried a younger brother 2 years before. The brother had been the warm one, the one the tenants loved, and his death had left the barony to a man who had never expected it, and did not want it, and who wore the title the way another man might wear a wet coat. He was civil to Constance, and nothing more. He did not come to the schoolroom. And she knew him at first only as a tall figure crossing the wet lawn at dusk, hatless in weather that should have driven him in, and as a light that burned very late in the library on the nights she could not sleep. She had not meant to fall in love with a sad baron. It was the least practical thing a governess could do, and Constance had spent her whole life being practical, because poverty teaches a woman to be practical or to be ruined, and she had chosen practical every time. What undid her was small and slow, and entirely his fault. It began with the books. He had a library that ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and one wet afternoon she had gone in to find a Latin grammar for the children, and found him instead, asleep over a folio with a single candle guttering, and she had not woken him. She had only moved the candle a careful inch from the dry old paper so the house would not burn down around his grief, and she had gone out again. The next morning, a Latin grammar had appeared outside the schoolroom door. The very one she had failed to find, with a slip of paper marking the declension her pupils were struggling over. No note, no name. She had stood in the cold corridor, with the book in her hands, and understood that he had watched her without seeming to, that he had marked what she needed and supplied it silently, and that this was a man who showed feeling the way other men hid it. After that, they read together. It was the most respectable courtship in England, and the most dangerous. He would be in the library when she came down for the children's lessons, and he would have left a book open to something he thought she would like. A passage of Cowper, a map of the Aegean, a line of Greek she could translate and he could not, and they would talk across the long table with the rain on the windows and the fire low. He spoke in short sentences, level and plain, like a man rationing himself. She learned to read the rest in his hands, in the way his thumb moved along the edge of a page when he was about to say something that mattered, in the single time his voice caught and he turned it into a cough. He proposed to her on the cliff above the cove, on a clear, cold afternoon in March, and he did it badly, which was how she knew he meant it. A practiced man proposes well. Everard stood with his back half to her, and the wind taking his words, and said that he had no right to ask, that she could do better than a house full of ghosts, that he would understand if she refused and would see her settled somewhere kinder. Then he turned around and looked at her directly for the first time in his life, his gray eyes very steady, and said the only plain thing he said all day. He said he did not want to read alone anymore. She married him 3 weeks later in the same church where they were now burying her empty coffin, and the county had decided, the space of a single Sunday, exactly what she was. To Treneck and to Stonewell, and to every fine house within 20 miles, Constance was an adventuress, a governess who had gotten above herself, a clever penniless girl who had seen a grief-soft barren and a half-empty house, and had moved into both like water finding a crack. They did not say it to her face, most of them, because she was Lady Carmody now, and the forms had to be kept. They said it in the careful spaces around their courtesy, in the way the conversation cooled when she entered a room, in the seating at a county dinner, where she found herself placed below women, whose fathers she could have bought twice over, in learning if learning had been currency. The one who said it plainly was Lady Sidney. It happened the first week, in the small parlor where the dowager held her morning court, and it happened in front of the housekeeper so that it would carry. Constance had come in to discuss the linens, and the dowager had looked up from her embroidery with a smile of perfect sweetness, and said, loud enough for the housekeeper to hear and remember, that it was a charming thing to see a young woman so very useful, and that she had always thought the cleverest sort of servant was the one who married her way out of service. Constance had stood with the linen book in her hands and felt the words land like cold water at the wrist, and she had said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse. And the dowager had gone back to her embroidery satisfied. What Constance did not know, in that first sweet season of her marriage, was that the estate was dying. Everard had told her he was not rich. He had not told her how poor. The barony had been mortgaged twice over to pay his brother's debts and his father's before that, and the income from the home farm and the few remaining tenants barely served the interest. Lady Sidney knew the figures to the penny because she had spent 30 years as the only person at Stonewell who could be trusted to keep accounts, and she had a solution to all of it, a solution she had been arranging quietly for 2 years before Constance ever answered an advertisement. The solution had a name and a fortune. The name was Miss Octavia Stern, the only daughter of a Bristol sugar merchant worth £90,000, a handsome, cold, well-trained girl who had been raised to marry a title the way a hound is raised to point, and who had been promised, in everything but writing, that the title she would marry was Carmody. Everard's wedding had broken that arrangement, and Lady Sidney was not a woman who accepted a broken arrangement as final. In June, there was to be a crossing. A distant cousin of Everard's had died in Ireland and left him a small property near Cork, the kind of inheritance that meant nothing, except that someone had to go and settle it before the lawyers ate it. Everard could not be spared from the harvest. Constance offered to go in his place. She had a clear head for accounts, she pointed out, better than his, and the truth in that pleased him in a way that still surprised her, that he should be pleased rather than shamed by his wife being the abler of them at sums. She would take the packet from Treneck to Cork, settle the cousin's affairs, and be home in 3 weeks. He came down to the harbor to see her off in a thin grey rain, and he did not say anything tender in front of the boatman, but he held her hand a moment too long on the wet stone of the quay, and he said, "Lo, come back to me." Those were the last words she heard him say before the sea. The packet went down on the Treneck bar on the second night out, beating back into harbor against a gale that came up too fast for the master to run before it. Constance remembered very little of it with any order. She remembered the deck going from under her. She remembered cold beyond anything she had a word for. Cold that was not a feeling, but a hand that closed around her whole body and squeezed. She remembered a spar and clinging, and the long black swells lifting her and dropping her, and the lights of Treneck swinging far off and then gone. She did not remember coming ashore. She woke 3 days later in a low cottage at the far end of the next parish, in a bed that smelled of fish oil and clean wool, with a fever that took most of the next month, and a deep cut along her hairline that the fisherman's widow, who had pulled her from the surf, had stitched with a sail needle and waxed thread. The widow's name was Tamsin Pierce, and she saved Constance's life and asked nothing for it, and Constance would not forget that as long as she lived, for weeks, Constance did not know her own name. The fever ate it. When her wits came back, they came back in pieces, and the first whole thing she could hold was a man's voice on a wet quay saying, "Come back to me." And she clung to that the way she had clung to the spar. She could not write. Her hand shook too badly to hold a pen for a month, and the nearest post was a half-day's walk that Tamsin Pierce could not make and leave her, and even when at last a letter went, carried by a carter to the Stonewell Road, no answer came. She told herself the answer was lost. She told herself the carter had failed. She lay in the fish oil dark and built her husband's face out of memory, plank by plank, and held to the certainty that he was searching the whole coast for her, that any morning his gray eyes would fill the cottage door. He was not searching. By the time Constance could stand, by the time the cut along her hairline had healed to a thin pink seam she would carry for life, Lady Sidney had buried her. Constance learned it in the village of Treneck itself, on the first day she was strong enough to walk so far, when she went to the church, meaning to send word to her husband through the vicar, and heard instead, from 2 women gossiping over a market stall, that poor Lady Carmody was to be buried Thursday week, and high time too. And wasn't it a mercy the Baron could now do what he ought to have done in the first place, and marry the stern fortune before the bank took the roof? She had stood very still by the stall, with her hood up and her heart slamming, and listened to her own death, described as a convenience. The story the Dowager had built was elegant, and it was cruel, and it had the shape of something the county already wanted to believe. Lady Sidney had let it be known, gently, sorrowfully, that the packet had indeed been lost, that there was no hope, and that a body would likely never be recovered from that stretch of coast where the currents took everything out to sea. That much was nearly true, and the truth in it carried the lie that came next. The Dowager had also let it be known, more quietly, to the few who mattered, that the marriage had been a sad mistake from the start, that the governess had been restless, that there had been talk before the crossing of the young Lady Carmody's reluctance to be buried alive, in a poor man's house on a wet coast, and that perhaps it was no accident she had been so very eager to take ship for Ireland. Perhaps. The dowager allowed with a sigh. The poor girl had simply seen her chance, and the sea had taken her before she could use it. Either way, the woman was gone, and the law and the church both required a decent interval and a decent burial before a gentleman could be free. And the dowager, grieving aunt that she was, would see that her nephew's house was put in order. The empty coffin was the order being put. Without a body there could be no certainty of death. And without certainty of death, Everard was neither widower nor husband, and the stern fortune could not be secured, and the bank could not be answered. A funeral with a coffin, witnessed, registered, mourned, would let the county and the lawyers treat the thing as settled. Lady Sidonie had pressed for it for weeks. Constance, standing now at the churchyard wall, understood that she was watching not a grief, but a transaction, a door being closed and sealed so that another door could open. The question that remained, the only question, was whether the man at the head of the grave had closed it willingly. She had come back 3 days ago. She had walked the cliff path in Tamsin Pierce's borrowed cloak, and watched the house from the gorse like a poacher, afraid to go down. She had told herself she was waiting until she was stronger. The truth, she admitted only at night, was that she was afraid of his face. If she walked into Stonewell and he looked at her with relief, she would have her whole life back. If he looked at her with anything else, with calculation, with dismay, with the particular careful blankness of a man, caught between a dead wife and a living fortune, then, knowing it would be worse than drowning had been. So she had waited and watched, and on the second night she had done a braver thing. She had gone down to the kitchen door after dark and found the one person at Stonewell she trusted, the old steward, Mr. Bohr. Sefton, who had carried her trunk up on her first day and called her "my lady" from the very start when no one else would. Sefton had nearly dropped his lantern. Then he had pulled her into the cold scullery and shut the door and wept. An old man's hard sparse weeping, and told her in a rush everything she had not been able to bear to ask, that the master had not eaten properly in a month, that he had ridden the whole coast himself for 3 weeks after the wreck, every cove, every beach, until his horse foundered and he went on foot, and had come back each night, soaked to the skin, and said nothing, and gone out again at dawn. That he had only stopped when the dowager brought him a sworn statement from the packet-master's mate, a survivor, swearing he had seen Lady Carmody go over the side in the worst of it and not come up. That the funeral was the dowager's doing, and the master had fought it, had refused it 3 times, and had at last given way, not because he believed it, but because he could no longer stand. And the bank had given him a date, and that Miss Stern had been at the house twice that week with her father, and that the dowager smiled all through dinner. He fought it 3 times. Constance had held that to herself for 2 days, the way she had once held a man's voice in the fevered dark. He fought it 3 times. It was not proof. A man might fight a funeral and still mean to marry the fortune after. Even so, it was the first plank of a different house than the one her fear had been building, and she had come to the churchyard this morning to see the rest of it with her own eyes. Now she looked at him across the graves and read his hands. He stood bareheaded in the gray light with his hat held against his chest, and he was thinner than she had ever seen him, the bones of his face standing up under the skin, and he did not weep, because men of his county did not weep at funerals, and the dowager beside him in her Honiton lace was the very picture of supported grief. Constance, though, had spent 6 months learning to read the rest of this man in his hands, and his hands told her the truth his face refused to. The hand that held the hat was white at the knuckle, gripping the brim so hard the felt had crushed. The other hung at his side, and as the vicar said the last words and the first earth went down onto the empty box, that hand opened and closed, opened and closed, as if it were reaching for something that was not there and would not stop reaching. She watched him sway, very slightly the way a man sways who is holding himself upright by an act of will against a wind no one else can feel. She watched him look down into the grave at the box he knew was light as a hamper, and she watched something cross his face that no arrangement of the dowager's could have produced, a a look of such plain and private ruin that the breath went out of Constance against the churchyard wall, and she had her answer. He believed her dead, and it was killing him. Everything in her wanted to cross the grass that instant. She got as far as taking her hand from the wall. Then Lady Sidney turned her head. The dowager turned to murmur something to her nephew, some small managing word of comfort that was really a word of control. And in turning, she let her veiled gaze travel out across the crowd of fisherfolk with the idle vigilance of a woman who has learned to watch a room for threats. Her eyes passed over the hooded figure at the wall and moved on. Then, a half-second later, they came back. Constance saw the dowager go still. She saw the lace veil hang motionless in the windless churchyard, while behind it a calculation she could not see ran cold and fast to its conclusion. The dowager did not know her, not certainly, not at 40 feet under a fisherman's hood. Still, the dowager knew the shape of trouble, and a still hooded woman at the back of a funeral was a shape she did not like. And Constance understood with a cold clarity that if she let her hood fall, now, here, on the dowager's ground, with the bank's date already set, and the survivor's sworn statement already filed, and the whole machinery of her death already turning, she would be a hysterical impostor before she had finished saying her own name. The dowager would see to it. A wild woman in a dead woman's clothes, claiming to be the drowned baroness, conveniently appearing the very day the inconvenient marriage was at last laid to rest. Who would believe her against the grieving aunt and the sworn survivor and the registered grave? She would not give the dowager that. She had not survived the Trennick bar to be called mad in a churchyard. She drew her hood closer and turned and walked back up the cliff path while the spades were still working, and she did not let herself run, and she kept her eyes ahead the whole climb, and the not looking back was the hardest thing she had done since the sea. That night, in Tamsin Pierce's cottage, Constance stopped being afraid and started being clever. She had spent 6 months building a wall of fear between herself and her husband, and the look on his face at the grave had brought it down, and what stood behind it was a clear, cold engine of a mind that had once kept a poor clergyman's household solvent on £40 a year and had married a baron partly for love. Watch a good man be ruined by people cleverer at sums than he was. She did not need to throw herself on Everard's mercy. She needed to prove she was alive in a manner the dowager could not turn into madness, and she needed to prove it where the whole county would witness it, and she needed the proof to land at the exact moment the dowager was most certain of her victory. The chance was 3 weeks off, and the dowager had built it herself. For Lady Sidney, having buried the wife, had not wasted the season. The wedding of Everard and Miss Octavia Stern was to be the event that announced to the entire county that order had been restored at Stonewell. It would not be a quiet affair. The dowager wanted it seen. There was to be a betrothal ball first, at the Stern house at Bristol's Edge, but really at the dowager's direction, a great lit gathering of every family of consequence within 30 miles. The very people who had decided 6 months ago that Constance was an adventuress gathered now to watch the adventuress's husband do at last the sensible thing. The dowager had, even with a cruelty so refined it almost passed for grief, scheduled it for a fortnight after the funeral. Decent and brisk, the door of mourning held open just long enough to be respectable, and shut before anyone could ask awkward questions. Constance learned the date and the place from Sefton, who came up the cliff path twice more in the dark with bread and candles and news, and who would have brought her down to the house and roused the master and ended it that very night if she had let him. She would not let him. She made the old man swear to keep her secret 3 weeks more, and she told him why. And when she had finished telling him, the old steward looked at her a long moment in the candlelight and said, "My lady, you were always the cleverest thing in that house, and God forgive me, I should like to see her face." Because Constance had understood the true shape of the trap, and she had understood that proving she was alive was not enough. The dowager had built her whole structure on a foundation that was nearly true. The wreck was real. The survivor's statement was real, or real enough, an honest, frightened sailor who had seen a woman go over in the dark and assumed the worst and who could not be shaken by a hooded stranger's claim. The grave was registered. The bank's date was set. Even Everard's grief was, in its way, working for the dowager, because a man drowned in mourning is a man easily led, and the dowager meant to lead him to the altar before the grief had time to cool into thought. If Constance simply appeared and cried out that she lived, she would be one frightened woman against all of that, and the dowager would have her bundled away as an impostor or a madwoman within the hour. And the marriage would proceed over her, and Constance would spend the rest of her life. She needed the dowager to be the one undone. By her own hand, in front of everyone, and she needed Everard to choose, freely and publicly, and at cost, before he knew the choosing was safe. So she did not go to the ball as a hooded stranger. She went as herself, and she made certain the dowager would let her in. There was an old custom at such gatherings, half charity and half display, by which the family hosting a great ball would have a table set in an outer room, where the poor of the parish might come for the broken meats and the warmth, so that the gentry could feel their plenty witnessed and blessed. Lady Sidney, who never missed a chance to be seen as gracious, had ordered exactly such a table. Constance came to it as one of the parish poor, in Tamsin Pierce's mended gown, with her hair scraped under a kerchief and the thin pink seam at her hairline plain for anyone to see, and she stood at the cold edge of the great lit house among the fishermen's families and the cottagers, close enough to hear the music, and she waited. She waited the way the sea had taught her to wait. Through the betrothal toasts, which she heard through an open door, the dowager's voice clear and warm, proposing the health of the happy pair, the rattle of glasses, the bright cold laughter of Miss Stern, through the dancing, through the long supper. She waited until the very center of the evening, the moment the dowager had been building toward for 2 years, when Everard was to lead Miss Stern into the great drawing-room before the assembled county, and the formal contract of the engagement was to be read aloud and signed. The moment that would make the thing public and irreversible, and witnessed by everyone whose witnessing mattered. And at that moment, Constance walked out of the servants' passage and into the blaze of the great room, and she stopped beneath the chandelier where the whole county could see her. And she did not shout, and she did not weep, and she let the kerchief fall from her hair. The room did not understand at first. A poor woman from the charity table had wandered in among the silk and the candlelight, and there was a ripple of confusion, a few affronted murmurs, a footman starting forward to remove her. Then Everard turned. He was standing with Miss Stern's hand on his arm, and the contract on the table behind him, and his aunt at his shoulder, and he turned to see what the disturbance was, the dutiful weary courtesy of a man enduring his own betrothal. And he saw his dead wife standing under the chandelier with a thin pink scar along her hairline, and his own gray eyes looking back at him. And Constance watched the whole arranged world fall away from his face. The hat had been crushed in his hand at the grave. Now there was nothing in his hands to crush, and they simply opened, both of them, at his sides, the way a man's hands open when he has stopped holding anything at all. Miss Stern's hand fell from his arm, because he had taken a step without knowing. He took it, he said her name. He said it the way he had said "come back to me" on the quay, low and plain, and stripped of every defense, and it was the first time in that great room full of people who had called her an adventuress that anyone had said her name as if it were a thing they could not live without. He said, "Constance." Then the dowager moved. Lady Sidney was the only person in the room whose mind did not stop. Constance watched her aunt see the whole catastrophe in a single instant, and reach with the trained speed of 30 years' management for the only weapon that could still save the structure. The dowager stepped forward into the silence, with her hand out as if to gentle a frightened animal, and her voice came warm and sorrowful, and pitched to carry to every corner, and she said that this was a cruel and pitiable thing, that grief did strange work on the lowly mind, that the poor creature was plainly some unfortunate of the parish-driven witless by the loss of her own husband to the same sea that she had heard of the dear departed baroness, and fixed her broken wits upon her, and that she must be removed at once, and gently, before she did herself an injury. And would two of the footmen kindly see the poor mad thing safely out? It was very good. Constance, who hated her, could admire how good it was. In one breath, the dowager had named her mad, named her poor, named her an impostor, and handed the room a comfortable story that let every person in it keep their supper down and their world intact. The footmen hesitated, only because the master had not moved, and Constance saw in the faces turning from her to the dowager and back that it was working, that the warm, sorrowful lie was settling over the room like the lid of a box, and that she had perhaps 30 seconds before it closed. She did not raise her voice to fight it. She had learned at the linen book 6 months ago that you cannot outshout Lady Sidney. You can only outknow her. So Constance spoke quietly into the held breath of the room, and she did not speak to the county, and she did not speak to her husband. She spoke to the dowager, and she said one ordinary thing. She said that the survivor's mate, who swore he saw her drown, was a man named Hoddy, with a withered left hand, and that he had been 3 days in his bunk with a broken arm before ever the packet sailed, and had not been on deck the night of the wreck at all, and that the dowager had paid him £11 for his statement. Sefton had carried the money. The room went very still. It was a small thing. It was not a cry of "I am alive." It was not a wife's tears. It was not anything the dowager's story had armored itself against. It was a fact, a specific and checkable and ruinous fact. The kind of fact a madwoman could not possibly know, and a clergyman's daughter who had kept accounts her whole life and had spent 2 nights in a scullery with a weeping old steward most certainly could. Constance watched it land. She watched the dowager's warm, sorrowful face hold its expression one instant too long, the way a face holds when the mind behind it has been struck and is racing to find the next plank and finding none. She watched Lady Sidney's gloved hand close on nothing, and she watched the county, who had wanted so much to believe the comfortable lie, turn slowly to look at the grieving aunt with the first cold seed of a different question. For a fact has a property the dowager's whole structure had been built to avoid. A fact could be checked. There was a man named Hoddy. He could be sent for. The packet's articles could be read, and they would show a deckhand with a broken arm. The £11 could be traced. And every person in that room understood, in the silence after Constance's quiet sentence, that a poor mad impostor does not know the name and the injury and the price of the dowager's bought witness, and that the only sort of woman who could know such a thing was the woman the dowager had just sworn was dead. Everard had not taken his eyes from his wife through any of it. Now he turned, slowly, and looked at his aunt. Constance had feared, through all the long nights of planning, that this would be the moment she lost him, that even believing her alive he might falter, might be governed by 30 years of his aunt's voice in his ear, might think of the bank and the mortgage and the £90,000 and the whole crushing weight of a poor barony, and choose the sensible thing one final time. The minimum he had to do was very small. He had only to cross the room. She had built the whole evening so that the only thing left for him to supply was the thing no plan of hers could manufacture, the free choice of a man who did not yet know the bank was beaten, who could still in that instant have chosen the fortune and let his aunt finish removing the madwoman, and who would have to choose his wife, not because it was safe, but because it was true. He crossed the room. He did not make a speech. He had never made a speech in his life. He walked past Miss Stern, and past the table with the contract on it, and past his aunt with her gloved hand closed on nothing, and he came to where Constance stood under the chandelier in a fisherwoman's mended gown, and he stopped in front of her close, the way he had stopped in front of her once in the library with the rain on the windows. He looked at the thin pink seam along her hairline as if he would set his whole soul to the healing of it. Then he turned, keeping her hand in both of his, and he said to the room the only words he needed to say. And they were 6. He said, "This is my wife, Lady Carmody." That was all. He did not denounce his aunt. He did not break the contract aloud, or rage at Miss Stern, or call for the man Hoddy, or do any of the loud things a lesser story would have required. He had matched the lie with a fact, and the dowager's whole performance with a plain man's plain claim, name and title given freely before the county. And it was enough, because the room had already turned, and a claimed wife is not removed by footmen. And the contract on the table was so much waste paper. The instant the groom named another woman his living lawful wife in front of every family of consequence within 30 miles, Lady Sidney did not collapse. She was not a woman who collapsed, and the niche of her world did not require it. Constance watched the dowager understand that she had lost, watched the long calculation behind the lace come at last to the only sum that was left, and watched her aunt do the single dignified thing available to a defeated general. She inclined her head. To Constance, not to her nephew, the smallest possible bow, the acknowledgement, one careful adversary, gives another, at the end of a long game played for high stakes and lost on a fact she had not thought a kitchen could know. Then she gathered her Honiton lace about her, and walked from the room with her back straight, and she did not return, and the county parted to let her go, in a silence that was its own slow verdict. Miss Octavia Stern, who had been promised a title since the schoolroom, and had done nothing worse than believe what she was told, stood a moment by the abandoned contract with her cold, handsome face working, and then she did a thing Constance had not expected and never forgot. She picked up the contract, the engagement her father had bought and her whole life had pointed at, and she tore it once across. And she set the halves down on the table with great care, and she said, to no one and to everyone, that she had been told there was no wife. It was not an apology. It was a fact of her own, offered into a room that had suddenly developed an appetite for facts, and it was the nearest thing to grace that a girl raised as a hound to point could manage. And Constance, who might have hated her, found she could not. What happened after happened. Quietly, the way the things that matter most usually do. They did not speak of any of it that night. There was too much of it, and the room was too full. Everard took her home to Stonewell in the dark. In the same carriage she should have died too far from to ever ride in again, and he did not let go of her hand the whole way, and twice he raised it to his mouth and held it there, and neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying that the held hand did not say better. The mortgage was not magicked away by love. Constance would not have respected a story in which it was, and neither, in the months that followed, did she let it be. The barony was still poor, and the bank still wanted its money, and the £90,000 of the Stern fortune was gone for good, torn across on a Bristol table. What saved Stonewell in the end was the thing that had nearly cost Constance her life. The clear, cold head for accounts that the dowager had spent 30 years using against the family, and that Constance now turned, at last, to its defense. She read the books, all of them, the way she had once read Greek. She found the leaks the dowager had let run because a poor and grieving baron was easier to manage than a solvent one. She let 2 unprofitable farms and stocked the cove properly, and made terms with the bank that a clergyman's daughter could make, and a proud baron never would have, and within 3 years, Stonewell paid its own way for the first time in a generation, and the county that had called her an adventuress called her, with a short memory of counties, a very managing sort of woman, and meant it almost kindly. The man Hoddy was found, and the £11 was traced, and it would have been the easiest thing in the world to ruin Lady Sidney with it, to drag her bought lie into a magistrate's court and break her. Constance did not. She had not survived the sea to spend her one returned life as a vengeful woman, and she understood in a way her tender, outraged heart took time to accept, that the dowager had not been a monster, but a frightened steward of a falling house, who had done a cruel, wrong thing for a reason that was not money, but fear. The fear of watching the family she had served all her life go under, for want of a fortune she had spent 2 years securing. So Constance let her go. The dowager removed to Bath on a small annuity that Constance herself, over Everard's objection, made certain, was enough to live on with dignity. And the 2 women never met again, and once a year at Christmas a stiff short letter came from Bath that was not an apology and was not nothing, and Constance answered every one. Mr. Sefton lived to be very old at Stonewell and was never again allowed to carry anyone's trunk, on the firm grounds that he had carried hers up on the first day, and that was honor enough for one steward. Tamsin Pierce was brought to a snug cottage on the estate with a slate roof and a stocked larder, and a standing place at the Stonewell table whenever she would take it, which was seldom, being a proud woman, but the place was always kept. The prayer book with the pressed forget-me-not, which had gone down with the packet, and which Constance had mourned more than her gowns, was the one thing the sea gave back, washed up on the Treneck shingle a month after the ball, swollen and ruined and unreadable, the little blue flower, a stain of itself between two stuck pages, and Constance dried it on the library window-sill and kept it, not for the prayers which the salt had taken, but for the flower, which it had not. On a clear cold afternoon the following March, a year almost to the day, from a bad proposal on a cliff, Constance and Everard walked out to that same cliff above the cove where the sea had nearly kept her. And they stood at the edge of it in the thin gold light, with the gorse coming into bud around them. And they did not say very much. He stood with his back half to her, the way he always did before the things that mattered, and the wind took the first words so that she had to ask him to say them again. And when he turned around and said them to her face, his gray eyes were very steady and very full, and what he said was not grand. He said that he had read alone for a month after the wreck and could not do it, that the silence of the library had nearly finished what the sea began, and that he did not intend, for as long as he lived, to read alone again. Below them the tide came in over the Treneck bar, white on the shingle, the same indifferent sea that had taken her and given her back, and Constance stood with her husband's hand in both of hers on the cliff where he had once not known how to ask, and she watched the water she would never again be afraid of, and she was at last and entirely seen. Thank you for staying with her all the way to the cliff. If Constance found her way back to anyone you have been waiting to forgive, sit with that a moment before the fire goes down,